Okay, am I on the mic here? Let's get started. It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next session, our next speaker, Dr. Katherine Hayhoe. Climate change seems so overwhelming because it's so complex, it's difficult to comprehend. Kevin O'Brien, in his 2017 book, The Violence of Climate Change, describes climate change as a scientific problem, an environmental problem, a human problem, a political problem, an economic problem, and a religious problem. He goes on to state, and I quote, "As a wicked problem of structural violence, climate change is not unprecedented. Racism, classism, sexism, ethnocentrism, and heterosexism are also wicked problems of structural violence, and human beings have been struggling with these problems for centuries, and at least some cases for as long as humans have been on a species. Climate injustice is a new addition to the list, but it fits into the pre-existing category of structural violence. Furthermore, because the types of harm inflicted by climate change are primarily borne by the poor and marginalized while primarily being caused by the rich and powerful, climate change continues and exacerbates other forms of structural violence." O'Brien, in his book, cites the work of Christian ethicist Cynthia Mo Lobita. Climate change, she writes, degrades, dehumanizes, damages, and kills people by limiting or preventing their access to the necessities for life or for its flourishing. And an insidious characteristic of structural violence is its tendency to remain invisible to those not suffering from it. Dr. Katherine Hayhoe has done more than just about anyone I know of to help make climate change more visible to large audiences. In her capacity as an atmospheric scientist, a compelling communicator, a policy leader, and a person of faith. I'll list here just a few of the many accomplishments and accolades she's received, and I'm quoting here liberally from her bios. She's a professor and director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University and has a Bachelor of Science degree in physics from the University of Toronto and a Master of Science and PhD degrees in atmospheric science from the University of Illinois. She has served as a lead author for the second and third U.S. National Climate Assessments and has conducted climate impact assessments for a broad cross-section of organizations, cities, and regions. She's currently serving as lead author for the upcoming fourth National Climate Assessment. She is producing the second season of her PBS Digital Studios short series, Global Weirding, Climate, Politics, and Religion. She has been named one of Time's 100 Most Influential People and the Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Global Thinkers, as well as one of Politico's 50 Thinkers, Doers, and Visionaries Transforming American Politics, and one of Fortune's 50 World's Greatest Leaders. She served on the panels for the National Academy of Science, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and many other professional organizations devoted to the understanding and communicating of climate change. Her work is fascinating because she challenges stereotypes. Her work is in part about climate change and also about faith and science. She's bridging the broad, deep gap between scientists and Christians, work she does in part because she is herself a Christian. Together with her husband, Andrew Farley, Katherine has written a book, A Climate for Change, Global Climate Facts for Faith-Based Decisions. Her work as a climate change evangelist has been featured on the Emmy Award-winning documentary series Years of Living Dangerously and The Secret Life of Scientists and Engineers. Although we would have loved to have Katherine come here and join us in person, it is fitting for a climate action event like today's to reduce our carbon footprint. Bringing her in by video conference does this. We hope others will follow this example in the future. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Katherine Hayhoe to Tulane.
Thank you, Tom, for that kind introduction. And thank you, everyone, for being here for this zero carbon presentation. I'm as sensitive as any to the irony of flying around the country to talk to people about climate change that's caused by our own emissions. And so the chance to be able to talk to you like this, I think really makes the point that in today's modern society, there are different ways to live than we've been used to in the past. So as Tom mentioned, I am a climate scientist and I study climate change, and I spend a lot of time talking to people about it. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is, let's just make sure you can see my screen there. What are the barriers that we run into when we talk about the science of climate change and we talk about climate action? Now, just to confirm, you can see the slides, right? Okay, excellent. I can see you too, so when you nod, I can see that. Great. So, if you've ever had a conversation, and I bet a few of you have, about climate change, maybe, you know, with Uncle Joe or your neighbor or your colleague or someone that you've run into, you've probably had an experience where that conversation didn't end so well, right? I can see a few of you, so put up your hands if you have had an experience where the conversation did not end so well. Yeah, that's a lot of hands. Okay, that's what we're going to talk about today, because trust me, I have had dozens, probably even hundreds of these conversations. And I'm not going to promise you that the conversation will always end well, but the conversation can definitely go in a better direction if we understand what's really going on. So, barriers to talking about and acting on climate. Now, we've had an interesting year. If you follow the headlines, you will have seen, if you will have seen headlines like, you know, the destructive impacts of Hurricane Harvey remain. And this is a headline from only a few weeks ago. You know, we don't often see the coverage months after an event has happened, but for people who live there, they're still picking up their lives months later. In Puerto Rico, 3 months after Hurricane Maria went through, roughly half of the entire island was still without power. Other headlines we saw at the end of this year were, you know, coral reefs are bleaching much more frequently. 2017 was the hottest year on record without an El Nino. There was wildfires that were on course to be the biggest ever recorded. And the Prime Minister of the island of Dominica said it well when he spoke to the United Nations. He said, at this point, to deny climate change is to deny a truth that we have just lived. So you think at this point, with these types of events that have unfolded in front of our eyes, how can we not have conversations about why this matters and the fact that it's real? Well, I love the social science. One of my favorite social scientists is a guy called Larry Hamilton from the University of New Hampshire. And Larry asks people the questions that I always want to know the answer to. So this fall, after all the hurricanes and the wildfires and the floods, this fall, Larry asked people, do you think that the recent extreme weather, talking specifically about 2017, do you think the recent extreme weather has added to the evidence of climate change? And then what Larry did was he divided people's answers out into how they themselves would identify themselves, not in terms of how much science they know, but politically. When he asked people, do you think the extreme weather adds to the evidence of climate change, people who would call themselves either liberal or moderately liberal, between 80 to 90% of people said yes. People who would call themselves moderate were appropriately at about 50%. Half would say yes and half would say no. And then if people are conservative, anywhere between 25 to 35% would say yes, and the others would actually say no. And when you look at headlines this last year, even you've seen headlines this last week saying things like this, the headlines are like, it's super cold, is global warming for real? Or, you know, the governor uses the deep freeze to credit the president with having fixed global warming, miraculously. Or articles like, you know, the phony prophets are saying that global warming is real. Everything, including the gas problem their great uncle had during Christmas dinner, is being caused by global warming. When we see headlines like that, often our response is, if they just knew the facts, they'd change their mind right. And this is our most referenced global weirding video. We have these really short little global weirding videos. They're about 5 or 6 minutes each on YouTube. And our most referenced video is, could you just explain the science to, you know, my uncle, my elected official, my roommate, my neighbor, my colleague? Because if they just knew the facts, surely they would change their minds, right? So we've explained the facts. I was the lead author on the National Climate Assessment, the first part of which was released this past November. It is the most up-to-date report on climate science in the entire world right now. The latest IPCC reports are about 5 years old. So this is the most recent, most comprehensive, up-to-date summary of the science of climate change. We have a 1-page summary, we have a 10-page summary, we have key messages at the top of every chapter, we have color graphics, we have tweetable links, we have everything that you could possibly have in a website. You can check out the website right here to make it easy for people to understand the science. And the science is very clear. When you look at the basics of the science, just to give you the 4 highlights from this report, highlight number 1 is the fact that our carbon emissions are growing. Now, over the past 15 to 20 years, our emissions have been consistent with a higher future scenario. It's true that in 2014 and 2015, emission growth rates started to slow down. So emissions didn't go down, but the growth rate started to slow. Not so much thanks to anything happening here, but more thanks to what's happening in China, because China has more wind and solar energy now than anyone else in the world. But we know that even if this trend continues, it's not enough to meet the Paris Agreement targets of 2 degrees Celsius. This is what we look like in the 1990s, and this is what we look like in the 2000s, growing at 3% per year as the rest of the world starts to catch up with our lifestyle, the way we've been doing things over the past hundreds of years. We also know that the influence of human activities on climate is enormous. In fact, according to natural cycles now, we should be cooling, not warming. So when people say, well, how much of the warming is human? Can you tell me how much of the warming is human? Our best guess is more than 100% of the warming is human. You might say, but how could that be more than 100%? Yes, because we should be cooling and we're not. So the report was very clear about this. It even went so far as to say there's no alternative explanations for the warming. And then it talked a little bit about how it isn't just what we see in the air, it's also what we see going into the ocean. Did you know that 93% of the extra heat that's being trapped inside the Earth's system as a result of all these heat-trapping gases that we're producing, 93% of that extra heat is actually going into the ocean? So when we look at global temperature, air temperature measured by thermometers, that's literally the tip of the iceberg of global warming. And then lastly, in this report, we also talk about what we don't know. We talk about how our climate models are incomplete. They don't have all the processes in it that we need to understand what's happening to our planet. And what's more, they're not just incomplete, in both directions. They're incomplete in terms of very likely underestimating projected change due to tipping points or vicious cycles in the climate system where we create a little bit of change and that sets off a cycle that creates even more change. So our report was very clear, and you might say, okay, well, then you showed them the facts, right? So surely people will change their minds. And this was the headline in the New York Times talking about our report. Why is it that all this information doesn't make a difference? It's because we are not blank slates. If we're assuming that all we have to do is tell people the information and they'll change their minds, we're assuming people are blank slates. There's nothing written on it. They're just, we're just sitting there waiting for someone to tell us the right information, and then we'll write it in. So what I love about the social sciences is you can actually test things like this. And so another scientist, Dan Kahan, tested whether if you give people more information, if that will change their minds. He says, and this is a paper he wrote in 2012, he says, public apathy over climate change is often attributed to a deficit or a lack in comprehension. People don't know enough science. And if people don't know enough science, then what's the answer? The answer is clearly to write another report. Because the original IPCC reports were written way back in 1990, and they got out of date pretty quickly. So they wrote a new set in 92 and 94, and then another set in 95, and then another set in 2000, 2007, 2013. But those were international reports. Maybe we need national climate assessments, like the first one and the second one and the third one and the fourth one that I'm working on right now. Or maybe we need some National Academy studies. And we certainly have National Academy studies too. We need color graphics, we need videos, we need animations. Maybe that will help people understand. But what Dan went on to find is that they conducted a study to test whether it's true that more information would actually help people understand this better, and they found no support. In fact, people who were most literate, get this, people who were most literate in science in general were not most concerned about climate change. They were the ones who were most split or polarized or divided. And here's some data from Larry Hamilton again, where what Larry did was he asked people, do you think climate change is happening mainly because of human activities? And then he divided their answers out by how they identify politically. But he also did one other thing. Look at the x-axis there on the bottom. He also divided it out by how much education people have had. And what do you see? You see that, you know, with high school education, people are pretty close together. And then the more education we get, the further and further apart we move. Isn't that crazy? So in some cases, arguing or providing more and more facts about this actually can be detrimental. Why is that? It's a casualty of a much larger problem that our society has. When the Pew Foundation first started tracking political polarization back in 1994, this is what the political landscape looked like in the United States. So the blue are people who would be Democrat, the red are people who would be Republican, and you can see two things. First of all, the averages are very close together, right? And the second thing is the distributions are nice and symmetrical. In other words, the greatest number of people are in the middle and the least number of people are out at the edges. Now, look at what has happened. Now, this isn't about climate change. This is just political polarization in general. Look at what's happened over time. Ready? Okay, so this is 94, 2004, 2014, 2017, and I'm going to show you one more. They did the same figure, but only for people who are politically active. In other words, only for people who vote. This is what it looks like only for people who vote. What has happened to society over the last 25 years? Two things. First of all, the averages are much further apart, right? And second of all, the shape of the distribution has completely changed. Instead of being nice and symmetrical with most people in the middle, they're completely skewed out to the edges, which means that most people are out at the extremes. What does this have to do with climate change? It has to do with a lot of different things. So for example, this is kind of depressing. If you aren't already married, apparently the number one predictor of who people marry these days, the number one predictor is no longer, appearance, level of education, cultural background, race. It's no longer anything like that. The number one reason or explanation for who you marry is how close they are to you politically. Isn't that depressing? Well, how does climate change matter? It matters because a whole host of issues have become politically polarized. This is just a snapshot of major issues prior to the last election, so about a year and a half ago. You can see that on many issues, people are very far apart, depending on whether they supported Clinton or Trump. But on climate change, it's one of the issues that people are most far apart on. See that? 14% of Trump supporters say climate change is a big problem, and 66% of Clinton supporters. If you also look at more general issues related to science, like do you support the science marches, we see big partisan splits there as well. And then, and this is a sad one for us scientists who study this world, they say, do you support increasing federal funding for scientific research? And federal funding has actually decreased significantly in many areas. There's a big split here too on people who do or do not support science research. So you might say, but if they just knew the facts, surely they'd change their minds, right? No, because people are not blank slates. We already have a lot of information written on our minds. And so when we have a conversation about climate change and Susie, the scientist, shows up with all of her scientific reports and data and facts, Calvin doesn't respond with more data. He responds with his identity, who he is. Because saying climate change isn't real or it doesn't matter is part of who he is. So rather than building a bridge, this digs a trench, and conversations tend to end something like this. Now, have you ever had a conversation where you kind of felt like that? I'm not seeing any hands going up. Am I the only person who's had one of these? Okay, thank you. There's a few hands. All right. So how can we have a productive conversation? I'm going to offer you 4 specific suggestions. And the first suggestion is, do not fall for the smoke screens. So I don't know if you remember or if you ever studied or heard of the Don Quixote book. It's one of those Spanish classics from hundreds of years ago that chronicles the tales of a man who was a little bit crazy, who went around tilting at windmills because he thought that windmills were his enemy. So he would ride up to these windmills on his horse with his jousting stick under his arm, and he would actually attack the windmill. Well, do you accomplish anything by attacking the windmill? No. So in the same way, there's a lot of smoke screens that people throw up when we're talking about climate change. And if we engage with those smoke screens, it's like we're tilting with the windmill instead of the real issue. So there's 2 major smoke screens that people throw up whenever we have a conversation about climate change. The first type of smoke screen is science-y. It's just a natural cycle, people will say, or we haven't studied it long enough to be sure. That one always sounds good. Or scientists are just making the whole thing up because they just want money. Or sea levels are actually falling, not rising. Or it's such a tiny amount of carbon dioxide, why do you think it's important? And then, of course, it's cold outside. These sciencey sounding smoke screens are everywhere. We hear them in conversations with our friends and our neighbors. We see them on the news all the time. We hear senators using them in Congress. But the reality is that the science is not up for debate. The science that we use to study climate, believe it or not, is the same radiative transfer physics and nonlinear fluid dynamics that we use every day in our stoves and our fridges and our airplanes. And you don't hear a lot of people questioning the reality of stoves and fridges and airplanes. People don't really have a problem with science that is so old that these are the real photos of the real people who studied that. We've known that our planet had a blanket of heat trapping gases that keeps us almost 60 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we would be otherwise since the work of Fourier in the 1820s. We've known that digging up and burning coal produces more of these heat trapping gases since the work of Tyndall in the 1850s. Yeah, 1850s. Isn't that crazy? Over 160 years. We have known how much the planet would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since Arrhenius calculated it in his spare time in the 1890s. Using basic physics that they understood well then. Why in his spare time? Because during the week he was winning a Nobel Prize in physical chemistry. And then on the weekends, he thought, oh, it'd be fun if I could figure out how much the world would warm. So he actually calculated it by hand. It took him 2 years, but his numbers were very similar to what we know to be true today. People don't really have a problem with the science that explains why climate is changing. And so when we engage with this and we're like, well, I'm going to prove to you it's not a natural cycle, and I'm going to bring up all the data and all the facts, and we're going to have this long hour discussion on how it's not a natural cycle, that is a smokescreen. Now, you may say, okay, but yeah, it's not really about the science, but they definitely have what type of objections? Religious-y type of objections. Bring on the end times, people might say, or, humans have dominion over the earth, so we can do whatever we want. Or in the Bible, it says there will always be seasons, and you're telling me we're not going to have winter anymore. Or God is in control, not humans, or those scientists are all godless liberal atheists. So is this really true? Are these really the objections that people have? Well, it is absolutely true that yes, you can even find senators studying the Bible to say why global warming isn't real, for sure. But when you ask people, for example, how concerned are you about a changing climate, and you divide people's answers out by their denomination, as well as their race, you start to see something really interesting. It is totally true that white evangelical Protestants are pretty much near the bottom of the barrel in terms of the number of people who care about a changing climate. But I want to highlight something else for you. I want to highlight Catholics. The least concerned people group in the US are white Catholics, but the most concerned people group are Hispanic Catholics. And you might say, but hang on, don't they, same Pope, right? And isn't this what the Pope said? He has like a whole encyclical, which is this giant book about climate change, and it talks about how it's so important and why it's happening and why we care about it. Yes. It's not just the Pope, it's all kinds of organizations. The National Association for Evangelicals has a book out about caring for the poor and how climate change are affected by it. This is just a small quote from a letter that 200 evangelical scientists put out a couple of years ago, talking about the negative consequences and burdens of a changing climate. The reality is that when you look at every major world religion, every single major world religion has tenets of stewardship or responsibility for creation and caring for people who are less fortunate than us. So it's not against Christian values or any type of values to care about climate change. In fact, if those really are our values, we should be out at the front of the line on this issue, not dragging our feet at the end. So people don't really have a problem with the science because we use the same science every day in our stoves and fridges and airplanes. And they don't really have a problem with the theological implications because they do not conflict with what the Bible says or with what any other major world religion says. So don't engage with the smoke screens, but rather confront the real problems. What are the real problems? The real problems are the fact that, remember, this and then this, we live in an incredibly politically polarized society where part of our identity has become who we vote for. Not just who we vote for, but what perspective we have on issues as diverse as immigration, the economy, and climate change. So where are people getting their opinions? So we're not getting our opinions from the data and the facts and the science. We're getting our opinions from people who share our values, who we identify with. So there are two very dangerous myths that we have bought into. One of them is that I have to be a certain type of person to care about a changing climate. I'm not. In other words, if I am liberal, if I am green, if I wear Birkenstocks, if I bike to work, then of course I care about climate change. But if I'm fiscally conservative, if I vote Republican, if I'm a Christian, if I'm in the military, then why would I care about it? That's not the type of person I am. That is a complete myth, and it is a very dangerous one because it leads us to reject information, not because it's incorrect, but because we feel like it doesn't fit with who we are. What's the second most dangerous myth? Well, this is a series of maps that I love. If you haven't seen these, you should check them out online. They're called the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. If you just Google Yale Climate Opinion, they'll pop right up. And they ask people all kinds of questions, and then they divide up people's answers by county and by congressional district. So what you're looking at right here is by congressional district. And anything that is yellow is greater than 50%, say yes. So in other words, do you think global warming is mostly caused by humans? Anything that's yellow is greater than 50%. Anything that's blue is less than 50%. And often we fixate on this map and we say, okay, we have to educate all these people in the blue areas because we need the whole area to be yellow or orange in order to act on climate. But this is not the biggest problem we have. The biggest problem we have is the next map, where they didn't ask people, do you agree with the science? They asked people, do you think it matters to you? And you know what? It turns out almost nobody thinks that it matters. So why would we support action on this issue if we don't think it affects us, number one? And number two, if we've been told that the solutions, not the science, but the solutions are punitive, are negative, are not just difficult, but unpleasant. If we've been told the solutions are the government's going to regulate my thermostat, the government's going to take away my truck, they're going to ruin the economy, they're going to throw hundreds of thousands of people out of work, they're going to let other countries take over the world. That's what we've been told are the solutions. So we have an imminent threat from solutions right here, at least what we've been told are the solutions, and we have no imminent threat from the impacts over here. So why would we want to do anything about it, right? Now, you may look, if you have sharp eyes, you see on this map, there are a couple of yellow and orange counties. This is counties, not congressional districts this time. Who do you think lives in those counties? Think back about 5 or 8 slides. Hispanic Catholics. Why do we think it doesn't matter? It's because if you ask someone to design the cover of a book or a movie poster about climate change or global warming, 9 out of 10 people would put this on the cover, right? Okay, now I'm gonna ask you another question. Who here has actually ever seen a polar bear in the wild in its natural habitat with their own eyes? I'm not seeing any hands going up in my view. Do you see any? I don't know, maybe I'm missing a hand or two off at the edge, but I do not see any hands going up. So my hand was actually genuinely up. I really have seen a polar bear in the wild, but not until just recently. A couple of years ago was the first time. So if the number one symbol of this issue is an animal that we have never actually seen in real life, why would we care about it? And if the people who come to mind that are being affected by this issue live in places very far away, like low-lying islands in the South Pacific, where most of us have never been, again, why would we think it matters to us in the places where we live, right? So the real issue here is not, and these are some more polling results, the real problem here is not that people on one side of the political spectrum don't think it's a big problem and the people on the other side do. That's the first line. The first line is not the big problem. The big problem is the second and third line, where the differences are much smaller, and you'd be like, okay, well, isn't that good news? No, not really, because the average is much lower. Nobody is concerned that it will harm me personally, or hardly any are concerned it will harm me personally. And much less people think it's actually harming people today. That is the real problem, right? Because even if you're totally sold out and you totally agree with the science, if you don't think it's a big deal, why bother? So the first most dangerous myth we've bought into is that I'm not that type of person. And the second one is, it isn't gonna even affect me anyways. These are the two real problems. So, how do we actually talk about climate change in a positive, productive way? Here are my best suggestions based on thousands of conversations that I have had over the last decade and more. Going into it completely blind, not knowing what to do, just talking about science, 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 and then having, people's heads explode and never going anywhere, and then realizing there has to be a better way to talk about this. So how can we talk about a changing climate in a productive way that meets people where they're at, that meets people's questions and addresses their questions, but does not engage with the smoke screens in a way that gets us distracted and unproductive, and does acknowledge the real problem, which is that people don't like the solutions or what they've been told are the solutions, and they don't think it matters to us anyways. How can we talk about polarized issues like that? The first step is not to start with the science. The first step is to start by bonding and connecting over values, concerns, loves, anxieties, worries, things that we actually genuinely share with the person or the people that we're talking to. What do we have in common? Then we can explain, why is this happening? Why might we care? But always, always, always end with talking about what we can do about it. Because if we have this giant problem that's affecting the entire world and our contribution is this much, and there's 7.5 billion people who are also contributing, I feel like, well, nothing I can do can make a difference. So why even talk about it, right? It's depressing. That's why we have to end by talking about positive solutions. Now, let me take you through each of these steps and give you some concrete examples, okay? Here we go. Bonding. What values do we actually share? There's all kinds of values we might share. You might be a hiker, you might be a birder. You might like going to the beach. I used to fish a lot. That's me. I fished every day from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. every summer. I like skiing. I'm concerned about the ski season because, for example, here in New Mexico, where we usually go skiing, it's a super dry La Nina year, but it's also exceptionally warm. And so the ski resorts are basically half open. I'm a mom. I would do anything for my child. It's really important for me that my child have a safe world to grow up I'm not a Rotarian, but a couple of years ago, I was asked to speak at our local Rotary Club. So I'm walking into the Rotary Club and they have, you know, a dinner first of all, and then they have a talk. I'm walking in and I see this giant banner that says the 4-way test. And I look at it and I think, hey, this is climate change. I mean, is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair? Absolutely not. In fact, that's why I care about climate change, because it is profoundly unfair. It disproportionately affects the people who have the least resources and who contributed the least to the problem. Would it build goodwill and better friendships to do something about it? Absolutely, yes. Would it be beneficial to all concerned to address it? Yes. Or if we don't address it, would it be beneficial? No. So I took the dinner time and I quickly rearranged my slides. I put in 4 different headers for these 4 questions. And I went through the 4-way test on climate change. This is to a room full of business people in Lubbock, Texas, one of the most conservative parts of the country. And afterwards, I still remember one man who came up to me. He was the owner of a local bank. He came up to me with this completely bemused look on his face. He said, you know, I'm not so sure about this whole climate change thing, but it passed the 4-way test. So, I mean, in other words, like, what can I do? Like, obviously it has to be true because it passed the 4-way test. Why did it connect with them? It's because I framed it around his core values. If something passed a 4-way test, it's got to be right. What other types of things can we talk about? Faith is a huge connector. As I mentioned, every major world religion has at its core concepts of stewardship or responsibility, as well as caring for people who are poor, who are less well off than we are. And then really the bottom line is every single person in the world has some type of value that can be connected directly to climate change. So everybody wants a safe place to live, whether it's a giant mansion or a tiny little house. Everybody wants clean water to drink. Everybody wants enough food to eat for themselves and their families. Everybody wants clean air for themselves and their families to breathe, right? And everybody wants a healthy economy where they can get a job and support their families. Why do we care about a changing climate? It isn't because it's number 8 on my list and I'm like, oh, well, you know, it's number 8 right now, but it really should be up to number 3. No, I don't think climate change should be on our priority list at all. Yes, you heard me right. I don't think it should be on our list at all. The reason why I care about a changing climate is because it affects the things that are already on my priority list. It affects whether there will be safe places for me and my family to live, whether we're going to have water that's clean to drink and food to eat and clean air to breathe, and whether there's going to be a healthy economy. That's why I care about a changing climate, and I care about it even more because it's affecting people who don't already have those resources today. So in that sense, just about every single person on the planet has the resources, has the values they need to connect the dots. We just have to spend the time figuring out what those values are. And then once we have had that conversation, connecting over a shared respect for the military, or a shared love of birds, or a shared concern about the future of New Orleans and our coastal cities and rising as sea levels rise. Once we've connected, then we can explain. We can explain that, yes, it is real, it is us. Scientists really do agree about this. We can even briefly, and very briefly, we can talk about how, well, we know it can't be the sun causing us to warm because the sun's energy has been going down, not up. We know it can't be natural cycles like El Nino because they just move heat around the Earth system back and forth from the ocean to the atmosphere and back again, whereas the entire planet is warming. And we know it can't be the cycles that bring the ice ages because the next thing on that time scale used to be another ice age, which we have indefinitely postponed for thousands of years. But much more importantly than that, much more importantly, we need to explain why it matters. Why does climate change matter? It's because it takes the risks that we already face today and it exacerbates them. So what risks do you face if you live along the Atlantic or the Gulf Coast? Coastal erosion, rising sea levels, and stronger hurricanes. What risks do we face if we live in the West? Mountain bark beetles, large wildfires burning greater and greater areas. What risks do we face if we live up in the north? Thawing permafrost with our infrastructure crumbling and falling into the ocean. What risks do we face in the south? Increased heavy precipitation events and flooding. Connect the dots between something that we care about in the places where we live and how it's being exacerbated by a changing climate. One of the most powerful figures, I think, is this figure. I'm not sure if you've seen it. If you haven't, you can look for it online. It's called NOAA, N-O-A-A, NOAA's $1 billion weather and climate disasters by state since 1980. Texas is number one. Louisiana isn't far behind. These are literally the number of climate and weather disasters that have caused more than $1 billion worth of damage. Why do we care about a changing climate? Because it's taking these exact types of weather and climate disasters, droughts, floods, heat waves, hurricanes, storms. It's taking these naturally occurring events that have always happened, and it's exacerbating them. It's like we have a pair of dice, and the dice have a 6 on each one. But climate change is sneaking in and changing some of the other numbers. So we have more and more and more 6s. So now when we roll the dice, the chances of getting that double 6, which is the $1 billion weather and climate disaster, the chances of getting that double 6 are going up and up and up over time. That's why we care about a changing climate. But we can't stop there. The most important thing we have to talk about are there positive solutions to this that are compatible with our values? Because again, we've been told that fixing climate change basically means, as one man said when I was talking to a group of water managers in South Texas, he stood up at the end of my presentation, which was talking mostly about water and impacts on water. He said, you know, everything you've said makes sense, but I don't want the government setting my thermostat. And that was a very honest response, because we've been told that the solutions to climate change are punitive. They're bad for the economy. They infringe on people's personal liberties. That's what we've been told. So that's why talking about solutions is so important. And here's the fascinating thing. Remember this figure? We looked at this figure before, right? We looked at how in the other figures below, I showed you how people are very negative about whether it affects us or not. Well, it turns out that people are much more positive. Now, this is crazy, okay? But people are much more positive about limiting greenhouse gas emissions. You're not concerned about the issue, but you want to limit greenhouse gas emissions? Sure, I'm fine with that, because it doesn't really matter why, as long as we support action. So here again is that same map I showed you before. The percentage of adults who think that warming will harm us personally, and again, most of the country's blue, which means we think it will not affect us personally, okay? Now get this. Here's the percent of adults who support limiting carbon dioxide or regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. Why would they support doing that if they don't care about the impacts of climate change? I don't know, and I don't care, because all we need is the action to do it. Isn't that crazy? So people are not really opposed to the real solutions. They're opposed to, the solutions that we've been told are the solutions. And here's another question. Do you support funding research into renewable energy? Well, people might not support funding scientific research, but they sure as heck support funding research into renewable energy. So what type of solutions can we talk about? We can talk about solutions to build more resilient systems, more resilient infrastructure. Over here on the right-hand side is a picture from the Netherlands. As you know, a large part of the Netherlands is already below sea level. So when they're building new neighborhoods, you know what they're doing? They're building floating neighborhoods. So if sea level goes up 2 or 3 or 4 feet, you go to the local hardware store, you buy a few more feet of anchor chain. That's it. Isn't that crazy? In Texas, this is the way that people often still water their crops, old school pivot irrigation. But this means that so much of the water actually evaporates, especially when it's hot out, before it actually gets down to the base of the crops. So people are installing drip irrigation in the ground to save enormous amounts of water. And some of our good friends who are cotton producers here, they're not really on board with the whole climate change thing. Whenever we have dinner, they've got a new, but you know, there's more polar bears now than there used to be. Or, you know, up in Greenland, there was this World War II plane that was buried in the ice under 200 feet of ice, so those ice cores can't be right. Every time we have dinner, one of these comes into the conversation. But they love their drip irrigation system, and they will talk forever about how many gallons of water and how many thousands and tens and really hundreds of thousands of dollars they've saved through conserving water. Over here on the left is a picture from where I live in Texas, where wind turbines are replacing oil rigs. So far, we have 16% of our electricity from wind in Texas. We've got over 25,000 jobs in the wind energy industry. And a couple of years ago, I was visiting a farmer about an hour south of where we live, and I noticed that he had a few oil wells on his property, but his neighbor had wind turbines up to the edge of their property line. So after we'd gotten to know each other and had a chance to, chat and figure out that I knew somebody who went to his church and he knew somebody who went to my church, so, kind of felt like we knew each other a little bit. I gathered up my courage to ask him. I said, so I've noticed that your neighbor has wind turbines and you don't. Is there a reason for that? And I expected him to say something like, oh, those newfangled wind turbines, I'm not gonna have the devil's blades on my property or something like that. So I asked him this and he said, yes, there is a reason. I said, well, what is it? And he said, I've been waiting 2 years for my wind turbines. My neighbor signed up before me and I can't wait to get mine. Well, I said, but I noticed you have a couple of oil wells. He's like, yeah, but those guys are always driving on and off my land, messing up my fields. The wind turbine people, they set them up and they run in from Florida. You never see them again and the check arrives in the mail. What's not to love about that? So there are ways that we can talk about solutions that are very positive and that just about anybody could be on board with. One of the biggest arguments I often hear, especially in Christian circles, is, but don't poor people need electricity? And isn't the cheapest way for them to get electricity fossil fuels? In fact, there's even books about the moral case for fossil fuels. But when you look at the actual facts, that argument starts to fall apart for two reasons. Number one, where are most of the fossil fuel resources in the world? They are not in Africa, where most of the billion people who don't have electricity live. They are in places like North America, Europe, Asia, places where people are already using lots of fossil fuels. What's the second reason this doesn't work? Because the cheapest prices for solar energy now are not in the United States. They're not in Europe. The cheapest prices for energy now are in places like Peru, India, and even sub-Saharan Africa. Solar energy has gotten so cheap that it is actually the cheapest way for many people to get electricity now, not coal, not gas. So there is no moral case for fossil fuels, but there absolutely is a moral case for giving people energy for sure. And clean energy is the way that that is already happening today. And we can talk about that, about the amazing things that are happening around the world. I love talking about Texas. You could probably find stories about Louisiana too. Here in Texas, for example, they have the biggest Army base, Fort Hood, in the US. It went last year with wind and solar over natural gas because they would save taxpayers $165 million. Who doesn't want to save money, right? We break records every spring for the most wind energy ever generated. There are entire towns in Texas that did the math and decided that they're going to go 100% renewable. This little town here is called Georgetown. It's north of Austin. It's a pretty conservative little town. The reason why they decided to go with renewables is because 3 business students at the local university calculated how much the city spent on fossil fuels and how much it would spend on renewables and how much it would save if it changed. They took their results to city council, and did they convince city council by talking about the science of climate change? No, they talked dollars and cents, and that is what convinced them. Isn't that interesting? So what are some concrete things that we can do and talk about? One of the first things we can do is measure our carbon footprint, step on the carbon scales, actually measure how much we produce, but then do something, make changes in our life, and then share them with other people. So for example, did you know that one of the most important things we can do, depending on our lifestyle, is to eat lower down the food chain? If you're a meat lover, if you eat meat like 2 times a day or more, maybe even 3 times a day, and if you decided, well, I can do without meat 1 or 2 meals, you could reduce your carbon footprint right away by almost 1 ton a year. If you decide you could do without beef, you could reduce it by about 1.5 tons. So it isn't all or nothing. Like, yes, eat it, the lower down the food chain you eat, the better it is. But even going from one to the other makes a big difference, and it's good for your wallet and it's good for your health too. I love things like the Citizens Climate Lobby Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus because it has over 60 members in Congress. It may be like the only bipartisan caucus in Congress that we know of right now. It has over 60 members and it's growing every single month, but you're only allowed to join if you have somebody from the other party to join with you. And they're talking about positive bipartisan solutions that people can agree with no matter which side of the spectrum they're on. That's a pretty cool thing to have a conversation about. I tell people about groups that talk about how conservation is conservative, how conservative leaders call for a price on carbon because it's a free market solution to climate change. There's even a libertarian institute called the Nikiskian Center that talks about libertarian solutions to climate change. Really? I love organizations like Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, who have even gone to the climate negotiations to talk about why this matters. There's all kinds of organizations, even the We're Still In organization that's still in on Paris. There's cities, there's states, there's corporations, and pretty soon there's gonna be a chance for individual people too to say, we're still in on Paris. We can talk about these types of things and they're positive solutions that are actually making a real difference. So how can we talk about climate? We can talk about it, first of all, by bonding over values that we genuinely share. Second of all, by explaining why it matters. And lastly, by finding ways that we can act together. So if you want more, you can, we have this little series called Global Weirding on YouTube. You can find it right here on YouTube. And one of the videos, if I just explain the facts, they'll get it right. This video specifically addresses a little bit of what I've talked about here, which is how do we actually have these conversations about a changing climate? If you're looking for more, you can find me on Twitter and Facebook. I am there frequently. On Facebook especially, I tend to post a lot of stories about positive solutions to climate change. But I want to leave you with one final thought. And this is my final thought from one of my personal favorite scientists. I grew up watching old movies of Jane Goodall when she used to look like this, working with the chimps in Africa. But after a lifetime in science, she said this only 2 years ago. She said, one of the biggest things I've discovered is that only when our clever brain that's full of data and science and facts about climate change, for example, it's only when our clever brain and our human heart can work together in harmony that we can achieve our full potential. So I want to leave you with this thought. As you engage, as you talk to people about climate change, think first of all, how can we genuinely connect from our hearts before we start talking from our heads? That's my question for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Katherine, for an inspiring, insightful, and positive message. That's fantastic. We have a lot of time, I think, or some time for questions. We're doing it a little bit differently this time in that if you want to ask a question, and I hope all of you, students in particular, will come up and ask questions, you need to face the camera here. In other words, have your back to the screen, which may seem a little counterintuitive, but that will allow Katherine to see you while you're asking your question. So don't all get up at once. Okay, I'll start. So I find intimidating, and maybe you have some suggestions on how to think about this or deal with this. It just seems like we're up against really powerful moneyed interests who want to distract, throw smoke in our eyes, and are putting a huge amount of funding into trying to persuade the public that what we believe in terms of climate change is not true, the science is not true, and so on. How do we deal with those issues? They just seem so, it seems like we're up against so much more money that's working against us than, say, conservation organizations and environmental organizations that have so much less money to try and influence people in political elections and so on.
Mm-hmm. That is a great question. And if you're interested in more information on what what Tom just mentioned, the disinformation campaign, so the very well-funded, very intelligent campaign to actually spread false information. There's a really good book, it's also a movie too, if you prefer watching documentaries, called Merchants of Doubt. So Merchants of Doubt is a book and a movie. You can find it on Netflix or Amazon. And it actually goes through the techniques that people used in the tobacco industry to convince us that smoking wasn't bad. And then I learned something new from watching the movie. It goes through the techniques that were used in the flame retardants industry. And then it goes through the exact same techniques, and even sometimes the same people, that are being used to sow doubt on climate change. So there absolutely is this concerted effort, and when you focus on all of the negative stuff going on and all of the headlines of all the things people have said that are just unbelievable, it is easy to give up hope. And so in this season of Global Weirding, we release a new video every 2 weeks. Our final video this season, later in the spring, is going to be, what gives you hope? Because that is the #1 question that I get asked these days. So I'm going to give you a bit of a preview on that. What gives me hope is when I actually look at what's really happening. The fact that there's more jobs in the solar industry now than the coal industry. That the Museum of Coal Mining in Kentucky put solar panels on the roof. The fact that China and India are leading the way in clean renewable energy, that pay-as-you-go solar is revolutionizing energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. The fact that over almost 40% of US businesses, cities, and states are still in on the Paris Agreement. When you look at that stuff, it's all happening despite the very well-funded disinformation campaign. There is source for encouragement and for hope, because without hope, we are going to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think it's too late, that there's nothing we can do, it's all over, there's nothing we could ever make a difference on anyways, then we're going to fulfill our own prophecy, right? That's what's going to happen if we think that nothing can be done. But if we look around and encourage ourselves by what is being done by people all around the state we live in, the country we are in, and around the world, then that makes us realize that it's not like there's this giant boulder that we have to roll uphill all by ourselves and our hands are the only ones on the boulder. That boulder is already starting to roll downhill. It's not rolling downhill fast enough yet, but it's already starting to roll downhill. It's already got millions of hands, possibly even billions of hands pushing it. And who knows how many more extra hands you need before it starts rolling fast enough. I really feel like that's a hopeful way to think about this. And when you look at what's actually going on, I think it's increasingly becoming a very realistic way as well. All right, is anybody else not intimidated by the fact that you have to get up and speak into a microphone backwards?
I'm not intimidated. What I'd like to ask is...
Excellent.
Oh, that direction, I'm sorry. Oh, what I'd like to ask is, what do you think will be the result of President Trump's increasing the tariff on solar panels? How will that affect the solar panel and and climate change, how we're dealing with climate change in the U.S., and will the U.S. be able to make enough solar panels to satisfy demand? And will it, if it doesn't, what will happen to the solar panel utilization in the United States?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So, as you know, this current administration is supporting the coal industry as much as they can, even though coal mining jobs have been declining for 30 years already. Even though a Chinese wind energy company has gone into Montana and is offering to retrain coal miners for free to work in the wind energy industry. Even though a solar panel manufacturer in San Antonio is taking in workers who lost their job in the oil patch in Texas when oil prices went down and retraining them to do solar panel installations. Even though, again, there's more jobs in the solar industry in the United States than in the coal industry, despite all of these facts, this current administration is doing everything they can to support the coal industry at the expense of the solar industry, which is kind of like investing in buggy whip manufacturing after the Model T Ford is already being produced. So what is going to be the short-term impact? The impact is going to be, first of all, solar energy prices in the US and solar panel manufacturing is going to be more difficult. It will likely cost the US jobs in the US. It will further accelerate the fact that the US is losing out technologically to other countries. The US is not leading the world anymore in the new clean energy revolution, and it will put the US even further back. I mean, imagine the Industrial Revolution back in the 1700s. Imagine if one country back then was making choices to deliberately put itself backwards into the Middle Ages when everybody else was moving into the Industrial Revolution. That is what is happening. It is harming US competitiveness, it is harming the US economy, it is harming the US job market, and is making very short-sighted decisions that benefit this much of the economy at the expense of this much of the economy, as well as international competitiveness. Now, long-term, what's going to happen? Long-term, something very interesting has happened the last year, and that is that many more people actually care about this issue now than they used to. Because one of the other myths that people have bought into, that I didn't mention yet today, one of the other myths is, if this ever gets bad enough, someone else is going to fix it. And over the last year, people have realized, you know what? No, nobody is going to fix this for us. So it's gotten to the point now where a lot more people are realizing, hey, we have to do something about this ourselves if we want to fix it. No matter what part of the political spectrum we're on, it does not matter, because this is an issue that affects all of us. We all want a healthy economy. We all want a safe place to live. We all want enough food, enough water to eat and drink, and clean air to breathe. So it just makes sense to look for solutions that are good for all of those things.
Hello. So I've spent a lot of time studying environmental sociology, and what they always say is that the way to fix anything is through collective action, but through collective action, you implement that through education. And as you stated, like, the education part is not working as well as it should be. And so it's not a simple question, but how do you think that individuals or communities can spur collective action if not through education?
That's a great question. Let me clarify that. I think that education on the risks the impacts pose and the benefits the solutions offer is absolutely critical. And I think that can make a difference. What I'm saying is more education in the science is not what makes a difference, because we need to engage with the real issue, which is that nobody thinks it matters to them, and nobody thinks there's anything we can do about it that would work. So I do think that education is very important in terms of making people aware of, first of all, the very real risks that this poses to us in the places where we live by exacerbating the impact or the risks we already face today, number one. And then number two, by educating people on what are some positive solutions that just make sense. So I'll give you one example. I got a plug-in car this year, which I love. And the first couple of weeks, we had the car plugged in outside the house. So we live on a street in Texas where everybody drives giant SUVs. And as your neighbors drive by your house, if you're outside working in the garden or something, they'll wave out the window. They won't roll down the window. They'll just wave, right? And smile. So I got this car. It was plugged in outside the house. Every single neighbor stopped, got out of the car, walked around, and said, "What is that?" And whoever was outside at that time of year, my husband or my son, if he's out there playing basketball, would be like, "Oh, it's a plug-in car." Does it have a gas pedal? Yes. Does it drive like a normal car? Yeah. Would you like to look in it? Sure. So what kind of mileage do you get on this type of thing? How much does it cost you? Oh my goodness, that's amazing. And then the next time they came by, they would roll down the window and they'd be like, "I love your car. Where did you get it?" So that was just one tiny little example of the benefits. Nobody had any idea on my street that you could have a plug-in car, that you could save tons of money, that it would actually look really cool, that it still had a gas pedal and a steering wheel. They just didn't know. So that was education, and I think that education actually really worked in some ways. In the same way, talking about stuff like, one of the biggest questions I get is, well, we could do everything we could do, but China's producing so much soot and so much air pollution, they're burning so much coal. China's building a new coal-fired power plant every day. Well, to that I say, yeah, they used to be, but did you know that this year at least they've been shutting down a coal-fired power plant today? Did you know that they are kicking the US's butt in wind and solar energy? Did you know that they have more of that stuff than anybody does in the US, and they're actually leading, and the US is trying to catch up to them? So there are definitely things that we need to educate each other on and be educated on ourselves that do make a difference. And then, as you just said too, collective action is essential, because It's one thing to say, I want to make a difference with my life, but in order to amplify my voice, it's really important to join an organization whose values I share, who can help me amplify my voice. So that's another challenge for you guys, is look for an organization that shares your values, that has a voice on this issue and speaks out, whether it's, birders. The Audubon Society has a great position on climate change. They do a lot of work on it. I work with a lot of student organizations and a lot of faith-based organizations, and I act as science advisor to Citizens Climate Lobby that has student chapters as well as regular chapters around the country. And there's all kinds of organizations that help us to amplify our voice, because if we are with like-minded people, that helps us to recognize that, yes, we can make a difference together. And that's really, really important, not to feel like we're this lone voice in the wilderness that nobody will ever listen to.
Oh, this is so weird. Hi, first I wanted to say thank you for speaking to us. It was really a privilege to get to listen to you. I watched the whole Years of Living Dangerously series, so this was wonderful. I wanted to ask you mentioned something about combating these differing identities that don't necessarily align with believing in climate change. And I wonder, how do you approach a conversation like that with people who have livelihoods that are intimately tied with exploitative industries? I think that's really relevant here on the Gulf Coast with a lot of people who work with oil and gas. So how do you engage with somebody whose livelihood and economic well-being is tied to those industries that are actually contributing to the problem?
That is an excellent question. And yes, I definitely have conversations with people, as I'm sure many of you do too. I think it really depends. So for example, conversations I had with people in Utah, for example. There's a little town in Utah where the only industry in that little town is coal mining. That's it. There are no other jobs. Except for, some service jobs, for the people who live there, and then there's the coal mining industry. So talking there, the solution, you have to emphasize, well, the solution is not to just shut everything down right away, because that would be punitive. That would actually be, it'd be terrible, throwing all those people out of work. There's no support for their families. What type of a thing is that? No, the solution is to recognize that we're already starting to lose our coal jobs. And I bet you've heard, so, imagine I'm talking to a coal miner in Utah. I'm sure you've heard, and you're aware, probably more than I am, that the coal industry's in trouble. There's been a bunch of big coal companies that have gone bankrupt the last decade. Coal prices are now really expensive compared to other sources of energy. You're probably worried about the future of your business. Well, wouldn't it be so cool if a company came into town to set up a new, say, solar panel manufacturing company or wind turbine manufacturing company, and they offered free training and a guaranteed job for you? Would you be interested in switching if they guaranteed your salary, if they guaranteed the training, and they guaranteed a job that is actually probably safer? Can you tell me some stories of the situations you've been in that haven't been so safe? How do you feel about the air that you're breathing in? Are you worried about your lungs? So you can have a conversation where you recognize the concerns and you actually want to hear more about the concerns they have, and then say, hey, what type of, do you think this solution might work for you? Or what about this other solution? Let's actually talk about what might work for you. When I have conversations with people, and I've had a number of these with people who are in leadership positions in the oil and gas industry, often our conversations kind of go like this, and a model one for you. So first of all, bonding and connecting. So we have to acknowledge the fact that the Industrial Revolution was fueled by coal and gas and oil, and it brought us all kinds of benefits. I would not be talking to you today using electricity and using the internet if it wasn't for the Industrial Revolution, right? In terms of our medical advances, I think I'd probably be dead by now if it weren't for the medical advances that came with the Industrial Revolution. I don't know about you, but I like having a fridge. I like having a stove. I like having a car. I like the technological advances that the Industrial Revolution brought us. The reason why there's 7.5 million people in this world is because of the fossil fuels that powered the Industrial Revolution. So we have to give it its full due for actually getting us to where we are today. But where we are today, we now recognize that there is another revolution happening. It's the clean energy revolution. It's the revolution where we're taking the old sources of energy and they're being transformed into new sources of energy that we know are already cheaper in some parts of the world, and they are going to be quite a bit cheaper within probably 10 or 20 years. So what I would say then is, I would say, you know what, you know energy. You know energy better than I do. Your entire career has been doing energy. So my question to you is, how can your company transition into the new clean energy economy where we can still benefit from your experience and your knowledge of generating and providing energy to us? And then we would have a conversation about what are their ideas about how they can transition.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Yes, you have to look the other way.
I know. This is a reverse from the group action. This is an individual thing, individual action. You know, I've spent years making choices, picking up litter, not buying the product that people drop. Whenever I take a walk, I usually bring a little paper bag. Sometimes I come back with 30 pounds of material. Some of it's recyclable. But in the years of doing this, I probably see one person a year doing the same thing. People are just walking past it. My sense is there may be a sense of nihilism with each individual thinking, well, what difference does it make that I don't do it because nobody else is doing it? Yet if we could all, 3 or 4 billion people could simply change that way of thinking, in an instant, a lot of problems would be reduced or solved. You know, obviously people are making the plastic bottles, making the aluminum cans and all that. But we could reduce the amount of materials used. We could recycle the aluminum so we don't have to mine it and ship it and purify it and use all the water and all that. But there's this situation where most people act when it is a group, but not when it's just them. Okay. And that's what I have a problem with. Okay. I'm thinking we could literally change so much in a week, except, of course, there would be some job relocation and disturbance with that. Thank you.
You are totally right. And in fact, something very interesting, they've done some studies just looking, say, at recycling. And they've asked people, do you recycle, and do you think your neighbors recycle? It turns out that everybody thinks that I do stuff and nobody else does. So even when you had a block of people that most of the people on that block recycle, for example, you could use whatever action you want. But even when you have a block where it turns out most of the people do recycle, nobody on the block thought anybody else did anything except them. And that's part of the isolation of our society and our community. We all live in these suburbs where we wave out the window to people as we go by. We don't engage in people's lives to the point where we actually know what's going on anymore. And so that's why one of the most important things that we can do is not only do what we're doing, but talk about what we're doing. So in other words, talk about how, hey, I just went to a lecture on climate change and it was hopefully really interesting. And did you know that it was a zero carbon lecture because they did it all virtually on video? Isn't that amazing? How many more lectures could we have that way? We could have like top speakers from around the country or even around the world. We could have them all on video, and then you don't have to fly everywhere, you don't have to spend all that money. We're actually saving the university a bunch of money as well as time, so we can all do more with our resources. So there's conversations we can and we should have about things that we actually are doing ourselves or we see other people doing, because otherwise, as you just said, our greatest enemy is fear and despair. Fear and despair, they paralyze us. That's not going to lead us into long-term change. We need hope, and for hope, we need to feel like there actually is something we can do that we can make a difference with, because everybody else is doing it too. And so that is one of the biggest things we can do, is that idea of not just individual action, but sharing those individual actions with others and inspiring others to act collectively together.
So I just want to thank you really, really deeply, Katherine, for a really inspiring and fact-filled and interesting and provocative talk. Thanks for coming to Tulane.
Thank you.
Okay, we have one more session in about 15 minutes. It's the student call to action, what can you do? So I hope many of you will stay around or come back for that, and then there will be a reception afterwards in the lobby outside this room, so don't go away.